So let's start with the quote-unquote simple animals. We're going to start with the invertebrates. These are just animals that do not have backbones. These actually make up 95% of the animal kingdom. There are a lot of invertebrates out there. So we will be starting today with the sponges. The sponges are one example of animals that do not have true tissue. So they just kind of have a uniform, more or less uniform internal body environment, and they do not have backbones. So moving right into the sponges. You might not have thought about sponges as being animals before, but they are animals based on those criteria, the characteristics that we set out in the last video. They are heterotrophic. They have to take in food from their surroundings, and they are multicellular, and they are eukaryotic. Sponges are the one animal that is stationary. I'm not sure what the correct wording is there. Sponges are stationary animals. They are not able to move around. They don't have muscles. So this is the one grouping of animals that's a little bit different. We said most animals can move with muscles, not the sponges. The sponges are fixed in place. Most of them are marine, so they live in the ocean. Quite a variety of sizes possible. Some of them are as tiny as half an inch. Others grow to be over 6 feet tall, so taller than a person. And they stay put. What they do is they feed just from the water that is around them, and they're called suspension feeders. So they're fixed in place, and what they do is they use the water around them. They draw in the water through pores, and if you look at the cross section that's shown here, there are some special cells inside. These are called choanocyte cells. They look kind of bluish or purplish. And each of these cells has a flagella. It has a little tail that's able to wave. And what those flagella do is help to sweep the water through the sponge body. So they keep things moving. And as the water flows through, comes through the sponge body and then out the top up here, as it flows through, there are cells that the choanocyte cells trap the food, and then they hand it off to the amoebocyte cells. The amoebocyte cells are more internal inside of the sponge, and these are the ones that actually carry out digestion. So they digest the food particles that are trapped by the choanocytes, and they also are responsible for making the skeleton fibers of the sponge. So there are fibers that are produced. Some sponges make rigid fibers, hard fibers, they're almost like glass, and other sponges make flexible fibers, and this just ends up meaning that the sponge is either a rigid sponge or it's a squishy sponge, like the more familiar types that we're used to thinking about. So anyway, two major cell types. The choanocyte cells trap the food, and the amoebocyte cells actually digest the food. Moving up a little bit in complexity, the cnidarians. These are also marine organisms. For the most part, they are marine, and you can check out the pictures here. This includes familiar things like jellyfish. Also included in this grouping of organisms are the sea anemones and the corals. So all of these, they have some things in common, Hydra too. All of these organisms are carnivorous. Carnivorous, that's right, jellyfish are carnivorous, and the way that they catch their food is by using tentacles. So jellyfish have tentacles that hang down. Sea anemones have tentacles that are sort of positioned upwards, Hydra as well. And these are representing two major different body plans of the cnidarians. Cnidarians can either be free-floating, like the jellyfish, they have their tentacles pointed downwards, that's called a medusa. Or cnidarians can be in a polyp form, and this is the form that is stuck to a rock and the tentacles are pointed upwards. So two different body plans, but in either case, these animals are using tentacles in order to catch their prey. The tentacles have some special cells called cnidocytes. I'm going to show you a close-up of a cnidocyte on the next slide. Let's take a look. Cnidocytes are stinging cells. So what we are looking at here, this is a polyp. Right? Polyp form as opposed to medusa. This is a polyp form of a cnidarian, and on these tentacles we're just going to take a look at a close-up of one of these cells. So embedded in the tentacle are these stinging cells, and the stinging cells have what is literally called a trigger. They have a trigger that can be activated. What would activate this trigger? It could just be as simple as something brushing up against the tentacle. So if you make contact with the jellyfish's tentacle, what's going to happen is you might get stung. And here's what's taking place. That trigger gets activated, which results in this coiled up thread inside that gets discharged. It gets released. That discharged thread then wraps around whatever the thing is that just brushed up against the tentacle. So that's the prey. This is how the prey is going to be caught. That thread wraps around the prey. And these threads, there are two different types. Some of them literally just entangle the prey, so they just sort of catch the prey and hold it there. Others do actually inject poison. Okay, so some cnidarians are poisonous, others not necessarily. Okay, that's the end of our radial symmetry for right now, talking about, right, cnidarians. These all have radial symmetry. Let's move on and take a look at something with bilateral symmetry. Bilateral symmetry, so this is like humans. We have a single plane. Right and left are sort of mirror images of each other, at least from the outside. And our next grouping of organisms have bilateral symmetry, the mollusks. Mollusks include things like snails. So we're looking at a sort of a schematic of a snail body here. The body plan for all mollusks has three key things, three things in common for all mollusks. They all have what is called a foot, a muscular foot, and this is what allows the mollusk to move. So think of a snail, right? The gooey part that comes out of the shell, that's essentially just the foot. It's a muscle that's allowing movement of the mollusk. The other thing that is present is a visceral mass. Essentially, this is just the body. The visceral mass is located up here. And you can see this is where the digestive tract is located. So those internal organs are located in the visceral mass. And then there's also something called a mantle. The mantle is draped over the top of the visceral mass. In this picture, it's shown in purple. That's the mantle. And if there is a shell present, like snails, many snails have shells. If there is a shell, it's the mantle that's going to be producing it. So it would secrete this material, this hardened material, which should be the shell of the mollusk. Okay, so those three things are present in all mollusks. Oftentimes, there's also something called a radula, and let's take a look at a close-up right here at the sort of the head of the snail. So what we can see is on this structure, there are all these little barbs, and essentially this is just acting as a tongue. It's something that can scrape things up from the ground, and this helps the mollusk to be able to eat, so take in food from its surroundings. There are three major groupings of mollusks. I've been referencing the snails just because they're familiar example. Snails are an example of a gastropod. Gastropods are one of our major groupings of mollusks. Most gastropods that we are familiar with are terrestrial, but there are also freshwater and marine types as well. And many of them have these really characteristic tentacles that have eyes at the end. So gastropods, that's one grouping of mollusks. Moving on to the middle here, we have the bivalves. Bivalves have a hinged shell. This includes things like scallops. There are both marine and freshwater versions of these, and they tend to be sedentary. They pretty much just stay put, stay in one place. Finally, last grouping over here on the right, this is an amazing grouping of animals, the cephalopods. Cephalopods have really large heads. Cephalo is referring to the head. So this is kind of what this word is, what this name is saying is head and foot. Essentially that's what the body kind of looks like. We have a head region on an octopus, and then all of these, well, they're not really feet, but these tentacles hang down. Anyway, all cephalopods have a large brain, and they are all marine. They are really fast and they are really agile. The foot in the body plan of a cephalopod, the foot is actually drawn out into these long tentacles. So a slightly different arrangement, but those tentacles are doing the same thing as a foot. They're allowing for movement, and they allow the cephalopod to catch and hold on to prey. And what I would like to do, just to wrap up this section, so talking about the mollusks, what I'd like to do is show you a video of a cephalopod. I don't know if you might already be aware of this, but cephalopods, many of them can camouflage. They are experts in camouflage, and it's just amazing to see this actually happen. So I would like to show you a video of an octopus. This is going to be interesting if this works. We're going to be watching a YouTube video inside of a YouTube video. Let's see if this works. Okay, so we're going to be moving in closer here. Don't really see anything yet, but we're getting close. There we have it. It's crazy, right? That's an octopus. It was there the whole time. There it goes. Gave off its ink, and it's going to settle back in and hide. Surveys its surroundings, and then it starts to match. This is just going in reverse so that you can see it really was there before. Just about invisible. So that's camouflage. That's an octopus. It's amazing how quickly they can do this. So octopus, this type of camouflage is something that is really interesting to study. If we could understand how they do that, and if we could mimic it, that would be crazy.